I'm Zach Beckstead. I'm an assistant professor at Brigham Young University, Hawaii, and I'm going to be the moderator for this live question and answer session with Jeff Reber. So we'll invite you to post your questions in the chat tool below. We'd love to get some discussion going, some questions posed to Jeff after this great talk. We'll wait just a couple of minutes or another minute to get going, and we'll be starting the questions. All right. Well, first off, Jeff, thank you for this talk. It's really nice to see you. Great to hear. That was a really wonderful talk. I just want to make a comment to start that listening to your talk, hearing those stories were really powerful that you shared of the rescuers, of your wife. So that's something that really stood out, and I think it resonates with, kind of looking at the historical look and connecting it to current issues was wonderful. And I like this idea of using crises as I think you used the metaphor of a magnifying glass and a microscope. It seems to work in both directions, to magnify, to bring something out into relief, but also to go into a lot of depth. So thank you again for that really just wonderful talk. But maybe we'll get started. I'll ask you a question that I've been interested in, and knowing your work and being familiar with your work, and even when I try and communicate altruism to other people and in the classroom, one of the questions that I get is, well, helping is helping. Isn't that what matters? That people get the help that they need. And you addressed this somewhat in your talk, I think. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about this. Why motivations matter in these larger experiences of crises, of rescuers, of nurses, but also in our ordinary kind of social reality. I didn't know if you had any thoughts about that.
Well, I appreciate the question and also your comment. Let me just say on the comment first that in my experience, narratives almost always carry the most weight when it comes to altruism, but also other phenomena. So I wanted to share some stories and some narratives, including my wife's, and she's not exactly a fan of me sharing her experience because she's very humble, but I think they carry a certain kind of punch, that a certain kind of impact that you don't get without hearing about these real life experiences. As to your question, I mean, I think it's kind of tricky because altruists, people who have been identified as altruists by the media or by psychologists, whenever they're interviewed and asked about their altruism, they don't describe themselves as altruists. And the answer that's given universally by rescuers and other helpers when they're asked, why did you do what you did, is because the person needed help. And then the reporter's not satisfied with that, or the psychologist is not satisfied. So they push deeper and try to get at this thing, we call human motivation. But the experiential aspect of it for the rescuer or the altruist is there really isn't a motive. There's just, you find yourself doing what you do. So it's, in a way, it's kind of like if I drop a pen while I'm giving a lecture and a student kindly picks it up and gives it back to me, that's what it's like for an altruist to jump into a river when someone's drowning and save them. They just find themselves helping. So I think it's really quite interesting that we have this difference between the experiential accounts of people who do rescuing and other kinds of helping, and we have the psychologists who are so interested in getting at some underlying motive. And that's a bit of a disconnect. I don't think it's a problem. I think motives are important. And part of the purpose of my presentation was to show that even studying the motive of altruism if we learn nothing about the altruist, will teach us a great deal about our own assumptions as a discipline and the possibility that we might want to consider alternatives.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, we have a question from Brent Slife. So love the talk. Could you say a bit more about the assumptions needed for human nature if altruistic motives were indeed real?
Yeah, thank you, Brent, and thanks for listening to the talk. As far as the assumptions I talk about with my students, obviously we talk about agency, the importance of that, as I mentioned, the possibility of putting someone else ahead of yourself, so self-sacrifice. One I did not get into much detail about, but I think is another important assumption that I study and talk with my students about, is this cultivation of character, that by practicing the virtue of altruism, and I know you've done work on virtue ethics, Brent, so you will understand this, but by practicing the virtue of altruistic behavior, you cultivate a character of someone who will, in fact, run towards the burning, car and try to rescue the people in it, or jump into the river. You'll develop that reflexivity, that reflex-like response when someone's in need, because you have been already primed, so to speak, by this working out of the virtue of altruism. So I think character development, I think psychologists would need to consider ethics broadly, virtue being one example, but I also think the ethics of someone like Emmanuel Levinas, who talks about the priority of the other and our ability to respond to the other, to either give or to refuse, would much better account for the way the rescuers, and I think maybe even the nurses I described at the end of my talk, would much better account for the ways they went about helping than the current ethical models that exist in our discipline.
Okay, so Tracy Simon asked a question, says, first, thanks for the talk, very emotional topic. As both the daughter of a Holocaust survivor and also a mental health worker herself, whose husband is an infectious disease doc, I agree that there is an inexplicable impulse to just help. This notion flies in the face of Freud's civilization and its discontent. How do you explain this dichotomy of drives?
First of all, thank you so much for listening to this, and I appreciate that you and your family are heavily involved in helping, and I would suggest altruistic behavior, though I'm guessing you and your husband would not describe yourselves in those terms. I think what we're looking for here is not that there's a dichotomy of drives, that people are either egoistic or they are altruistic. What I think is there's the constraints of the situation that make certain of these drives more possible in certain conditions. And when it comes to altruism, really most researchers who study altruism are only asking that it's possible on occasion, even if only rarely, that we actually consider the possibility of helping another person. So it's egoism that has kind of dominated the field. The argument of egoism is very different than the argument of altruism. For egoists, we must be egoistic all the time. For altruists, we're going to be egoistic probably a great deal of the time, but there's the possibility we could, on occasion, shift into an altruistic way of being. So I don't think they're dichotomous. I think that's kind of the way it's been set up by the egoists. You're either egoistic or you're altruistic. I think they're competing motives. They're both fully possible, but altruistic knowledge that helping at that level of altruism is probably rare, but is indeed a genuine possibility.
All right, thank you. All right, Mark Freeman comments. Thank you so much for your talk, Jeff. It was good. It was a good one, an uplifting one. I wonder though, is your perspective that we humans are altruistic underneath it all, or that we are, at least some can be, especially when motivated by extreme circumstances like the Holocaust or the current crisis? In a related vein, you and others, Franco, acknowledged that those who reached out to others were, as Franco says, relatively few in number. How do you understand this? I think it's kind of related to your previous comment.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for watching the presentation. I wrestle with this a lot. There are a couple ways to look at it. I mean, one is that we are altruistic underneath it all, and we have been trained out of our altruism, that we have been taught to be egoistic, that we have an initial response of I should help, and then comes the secondary response of wait, what about me? I'm open to that. I'm open to the possibility that we're in fact fundamentally altruistic, even at an unconscious level, and we have sort of developed into more egoistically minded people, or at least we use egoistic explanations more easily than altruistic ones. But it seems like, I don't know if the crisis actually brings out our more fundamental nature of being altruistic. I don't know how it exactly makes altruism a more legitimate possibility in the context of motives, that somehow, as Merleau-Ponty said, altruism becomes more specially favored. But I do recognize, as Frankl says, and you know, that it is rare. And the number of rescuers, you can see the known rescuers on the wall. There's a white wall at the Holocaust Memorial Museum. It's my favorite place to go in that museum. You'll see the number of rescuers listed there from different countries, and it is a tiny, tiny number compared to the population in Europe at the time. So I wrestle with it myself, but I'm open to the idea that maybe we are fundamentally altruistic, and we've sort of unlearned that in our development and training into an egoistic worldview.
All right, here's a question from Gordana Jovanovic. Thank you for your touching and yet convincing talk. How can we understand the dominance of self-interest motives in general understanding and in psychology?
That's a very good question, Gordana, and thank you for giving it and for attending my presentation. I think it's tricky. We can't sort of imagine ourselves outside of the worldview we've inherited. So we're used to self-interest being our motives. We're used to talking in those terms. But I'm of the belief that the dominance probably has more to do with our accepting a whole host of assumptions, including determinism, including a desire for a predictable world that's secure. And even if predicting people to be egoistic could be wrong, it feels more secure than the possibility that they could surprise us, that they might behave in ways other than what we would expect. I think the dominance of self-interest motives is more the dominance of our rhetoric about helping rather than it is the dominance of the actual motive too. I think we have just gotten accustomed to talking about motives with an egoistic bent. But I don't think that we are actually more fundamentally egoistic than altruistic, but we have certainly developed a way of talking about that. And now we understand ourselves that way. Psychology's contributed a great deal to that, by the way. It's been egoistic in its basic assumptions for a long time.
Okay, great. Well, let's see, we might have time for one more question. Let's look from Brent. He asked, do you hold that there aren't or can't be more conscious or deliberate altruistic motives?
I think there can be, I think there are. But I do think in moments when we're presented with a need for help, which we tend to be presented with without a lot of time to deliberate, I think in those motives, we tend to act in a more reflexive way, depending on the kind of character we have developed over our life. So when I hear, if I hear, this has happened to me, I've walked into a Burger King and I saw two probably 16, 17-year-olds harassing an elderly man. And they were doing it very publicly, very verbally. And when I walked in, there were several people in that. It was a crowded Burger King, and none of them were doing anything. And I just found myself, which is the wording I would use on this occasion, I just found myself walking over to those two young men, grabbing both of them by the backs of their jacket, pulling them in close to my face so they could hear me. And I said, if you two don't stop what you're doing right now, I'm going to take you outside and beat the crap out of you. And I said that not expecting to have to do it, but knowing that they needed a little bit of a strong response. And they both walked out of the Burger King and they both made, menacing, faces at me outside the window. And then people came up to me and said, "Oh my gosh, thank you so much. I'm so glad you did that. That was so, courageous," or whatever. I didn't think anything of it. I actually thought, why didn't you do it? Why weren't you there doing that? So often it's just like in the moment. You don't have time to really deliberate. And if you do deliberate, you're more likely to probably talk yourself out of it. But I think it's possible for a person to actually make conscious, deliberate, altruistic motives. What I think is more possible is that you deliberately try to be a good person. You deliberately try to be someone who is helpful. And then when those spontaneous moments occur, you find yourself helping. I'll just close with this. One of the rescuers that Monroe interviewed said something that became the title of one of her books. And that was that the hand of compassion is faster than the calculus of rationality. And I think that's really true. I think once we start to engage in that deliberation, we're more likely to let those assumptions of egoism slip in, unless we've developed a character over time of being a helpful, good, potentially altruistic person.
All right. Well, that was perfect. Good way to end. We're going to move this on over to Slack. So we'll put these questions. If your question wasn't answered, we have some really great questions that I hope we can get to in another forum. But just saying then, Jeff, thanks once more for doing this. And we just wish you, your family, the best in everything that you're going through right now. So take care. Thank you again.
Zach, can I really quickly show you guys an image of my wife's personal protective equipment?
Yes.
I put this together. Can you see it? I shared screen. I just wanted people to be able to see how it began in March, where she had very little equipment and knew she was going to get infected with it. And thankfully, by May, they have got much better equipment going. So I wanted people to just be aware of what you hear in the news about the nurses' need for personal protective equipment. It was very real and continues in some places to be very real today.
Okay. Well, if we couldn't see that, maybe we could even upload that onto Slack.
Did it not show up?
I didn't see that, but
I've got to select it. Hold on, real quick. You see it now?
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So you can see how much improved the clothing, the protective equipment became once. And by the way, this mask that she wore, they had to wear it all shift, 13 hours. Then they had to put it in a plastic bag and wear it again the next shift because there were no masks to be worn other than the one they were given.
Man, that's scary, but we're grateful then that she's being protected more. Just really do wish you the best and take care. All right.
Thank you all
Thanks,
for
Jeff.
being a part of the presentation, and I will be over on Slack and we'll happily continue the conversation there.
Awesome. Great. All right. Thank you.